It is a great privilege and pleasure to welcome you all this morning at the continuation of the tour de force of the Alex Keynan Science Policy Workshop. It is truly a privilege for me to open the session by introducing a dear friend, a remarkable scientist, and a great scientific leader, Professor Harvey Chopper, Professor Emeritus at the University of Hamburg. The scientific background and career of Professor Chopper is truly remarkable. He served as a research assistant at the Technical University of Stockholm with Lisa Meitner, at the Cavendish Laboratory, Cambridge, with Otto Frisch, and in Cornell University with Wilson. His research fields span a broad spectrum of areas of optics, nuclear, and elementary particle physics. He held various professorships in Germany and served as one of the great scientific leaders of our times. He served as a director of DAISY at Hamburg, which was truly a pioneering endeavor. He served as the Director General of Cern in Geneva during 1981 to 1988. His activity spanned a broad spectrum of presidencies in Germany, Europe, and all over the world. He served as the president of the German and the European Physical Society. Very significant and important as the president of the Sesame Council, the Middle Eastern International Synchrotron Radiation Facility, which really accomplished wonders in the role of science as a bridge between nations in conflict. Professor Schaeffer made seminal contribution for this activity. He served as the president of the scientific board of the IBSP of Unesco. He is a member of various academies, received a wealth of distinctions, honorary doctorates, the Grand Order of Independence of Jordan and the Great Cross Order of Merit of Cyprus, and the medals, the Albert Einstein Gold Medal, the Niels Bohr Gold Medal, and other distinctions. It is wonderful to welcome you here, Harvey, on this very, very special occasion. It is a great privilege and pleasure having you here with us, and it's a privilege for me to call on Professor Harvey Chopper to deliver his lecture on Centers of Excellence and International Cooperation the example of Cern and other laboratories.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, let me say, I consider it a great honor and privilege to be able to talk to you today. And I would like to thank, above all, of course, the President of the Academy, Ruth Arnon, for the invitation, and my old friend, Joshua Jortner, for these kind words. Of course, I accepted the invitation with great pleasure, but also with some embarrassment, I must tell you. Why? Because what can one say in Israel about centers of excellence? You have already some of the best of the world, so it's very hard to give you any advice. We rather could get advice from you. My second embarrassment concerns what has been said yesterday by Edward Brezin. I have some problems with the definition of centers of excellence, or with excellence in general, and how to evaluate them. But since that was treated yesterday in an excellent way by Edward Brezin, and I couldn't add anything to it, I agree with all words he said, I can skip that. So I gained some time for jokes or stories. So I skip that. Letting aside all these problems, what's excellence and so on, let me talk about the centers I know best, the international centers of excellence, and the one I know best is Cern. So we'll talk about Cern and, of course, concentrate on what one might learn from such a center. What is Cern? Well, the acronym of Cern is forgotten now. Nobody knows anymore what it stands for. It was initiated at the beginning of Cern. The N in Cern is still kind of a problem because it stands for nuclear, and sometimes it's misunderstood by people and think Cern is doing nuclear energy. Nothing to do with nuclear energy. So we considered several times we should change the acronym, but it has become a mark of quality, so it was decided to keep it. But we added that now it's European Laboratory for Particle Research, but you will see, as I show you, even that is wrong now, because in the meantime it has really become a world laboratory for particle physics. Let me say a few words about the foundation of Cern. It's not so much known that Cern is based on two initiatives. The first initiative, surprisingly, came from politicians. After the war, politicians came together and were thinking, what can one do to bring European countries together to do some peaceful work. And this was discussed in a meeting of what's called the European Cultural Conference in Lausanne in December 1949. And the driving people, many people were there, of course, important, but the driving people were Denis Derougemont, a Swiss writer and poet, and Raoul Dautry, a French administrator. And the outcome was that they thought a research center dealing with atomic or nuclear physics, or whatever it was, could be a good vehicle to promote these objectives. The second initiative came from the physicists. They realized in order to be competitive, in particular with the United States, it was necessary to join the European forces. And there the driving figures, again, many people were involved, but the driving figures were Lev Kowarski, French, and Pierre Auger, also from France, and Eduardo Amaldi in Italy. The two initiatives were brought together at a meeting of Unesco in Florence in June 1950, and there it was Idor Arabi who was the essential person. He formulated a resolution to the UNESCO, and Arabi at that time was the US representative at UNESCO. And it was essential that he formulated this resolution because that made it impossible that US could intervene in a negative sense for such an adventure. So they suggested that one should create a center for accelerator-based fundamental physics. Long negotiations started, and finally in July 1953, a convention was signed, And then it took another year. In the 29th September 1954, this convention was ratified. So that is the birthday of Cern. So this September, Cern will have his 60th anniversary. And the whole thing started then in Geneva. Oh, sorry. And you see there was nothing there. It started on a green meadow. So at the foundation, Cern had 12 European member states, which have now increased to 20. And many, not many, some additional countries are asking to become members. So there's a procedure going on. It takes several years now. It's becoming a little bit more complicated. So in the future, I think in the coming years, there will be 25 or even 27 member states. And one of the new member states will be Israel. I'll come back to that in a moment. The Cern has an annual budget. Budget is in Swiss francs, but it's roughly within errors, almost an American dollar. So it has a regular budget, which is provided by the member states of about 1 billion Swiss francs or $1 billion. But there are contributions from other states, as I explained in a moment. Here you see the position. It's in Geneva. Geneva is somewhere here. Here's the Lake of Geneva. Here are the Alps, Mont Blanc. And Cern is somewhere here. And the main instruments now are in a tunnel, 27 kilometers circumference. And the surprising thing is that this tunnel, like other parts of Cern also, crosses the border here. This white line is a border between France in the foreground and Switzerland in the back several times. I think it's the only international laboratory which is sitting across a border, and that never created any problems. Well, the science at Cern is not performed by the staff. It's performed by outside, called users, coming from universities and other national organizations. And there are about 11,000 users now. We cannot count them precisely anymore. And there's only a staff of 2,500 Cern. And in that staff of Cern, there are only about 100 scientists who do particle physics, both theory and experiments. So if I simplify the things a little bit, the scientific competence at Cern comes from the outside, from the users. And the competence of Cern is rather a technical one. Cern has to provide, it's a kind of workshop, if you want, or a service station. Cern has to provide the facilities, accelerators, and other things. So the main strengths of Cern are its engineers and the technical competence of these engineers. Of course, Cern is responsible for the overall coordination of the program and for the management and administration, things like that. Now, the 11,000 users come from all over the world. So about 7,000 come from the European member states, which are here in blue, and I hope very soon there will be a blue dot here, Israel. Then there are about 3,000 people coming, scientists, coming from what had been called observers. Now it's called associate members. These are the countries in green, US, Russia, India, and so on. And there's a number of bilateral agreements been signed with the countries which are here all in red. So you see it's spanning the whole world, except there's a hole in Africa, and there's not much interest among the ice bears in the Arctic. Now, the governing structure of Cern. Cern is an international organization completely independent from all national laws and regulations. Its governing body is a council where each member state has 2 delegates. One delegate is a government representative. The second delegate usually is a scientist. The interesting thing is in the council, each member state has 1 vote, independent of its size, independent of its contribution. And I must say what is not in the convention. Over the years, a kind of gentleman's agreement has been established that there are no fighting votes, as I might call it. If in the discussions a state would indicate that if a majority would overrule him, he would have serious difficulties, then one is trying to find another solutions. It never happened that a state was overruled just by a majority and was forced to agree to a program or whatever it was. The council is, has a scientific policy committee to give advice, and a finance committee, and then there's a director general, which is appointed by council. The director general, in principle, has a very strong position because it's only the director general who can make proposals for programs or also for the structure of the laboratory. The council can say yes, can say no, and say come back with another proposal. But the council by itself cannot make any proposals and cannot take any initiatives and cannot ask Cern to carry out a certain mission. And in that way, it was always avoided that there was political influence. Though, as I explained later, I think all the programs are based on the scientific competence. So that, I think, is a very important point, one of the points which are responsible for the success of Cern. And of course, in my talk, I will concentrate on what are the reasons for the success of Cern. Now, the other reasons for the success is selection of staff. The main principle is staff is selected only because on its scientific or technical competence. There are no quota for countries. No country can come and say, now I have a quota, the next this position must be filled by one of my compatriots. No quota. Every scientist from the whole world is welcome. If he can make a contribution, it doesn't matter whether it comes from a member state or from a non-member state. And also management functions. Let's say we have division leaders and department head. They are independent of the position of a man of the salary scale or his recognition. In fact, the scientists consider one of these management functions as a nuisance. They say administration keeps them only from doing science. So this is another point of importance. The other important thing is how are projects or programs be selected. As said, in principle, it's the director general who makes a proposal to council, but that is not how it really happens. The initiatives for new project come from the basis, from the users. And there are a lot of committees which discuss it and evaluate it and so on. And again, there are no national quotas. The selection of the projects and programs, again, is based essentially on scientific arguments. And the Cern management, the director general, is in principle responsible for the overall program. He's responsible that the whole program is consistent, coherent. But in my time as director general during 8 years, I had to take only one decision, which was not based on the proposals of the various committees, where there was a consensus among the scientific community. Of course, the projects are ambitious. They are at the frontier of world standards. So one of the reasons is, of course, one wants to attract the best scientists and engineers. But on the other hand, they are realistic in the sense that they can be carried out in the time schedules foreseen and within the budgets foreseen. Of course, only projects are considered by Cern which cannot be realized by one country alone or by a region. A few points on the management. One essential point is that Cern has a long-term planning. When one project, a new accelerator, a new machine starts, there's already the next one in the pipeline. It has already been discussed. I mean, usually there's a forecast of 10, 15 years for new projects. So the projects are very well planned. On the other hand, I would call it budget stability, but that is what it really says is that since 1983, the Cern budget is flat. Was a slight compensation for inflation, but no increase. Nevertheless, within that constant budget, Cern could carry out two large projects, was LAB and LHC now, each costing several $1 billion. How was it possible? Well, it's only possible because Cern, not being under any national laws, has a lot of flexibility in how to manage funds. For instance, Cern can transfer funds from operation to investment or the other way around. For instance, when a new machine is built, a lot of money is transferred from operation to investment and vice versa. This is usually in most countries not possible because Parliament insists that they decide on how much money goes into investment. Now, another important point is all the big projects of Cern are controlled execution. Even the industrial contracts are very closely controlled by Cern. Cern never uses general contractors. In many other fields like space or what have you, big projects usually are given to industry, and industry controls them and takes the risk. That's not done at Cern. Cern keeps the risk, carries the risk for the projects, and that is one of the reasons why so far all the projects were carried out within the time schedule and budgets foreseen. Of course, this is only possible because there's a very close collaboration between the physicists and the engineers. What is also important is Cern has an extremely shallow hierarchy, almost no hierarchy. Everybody can talk to the director general if he wants, if he's not just traveling somewhere around. So, but there's no formalities. Everybody is considered to be a colleague. Now, of course, I would love to talk to you now about the physics at Cern, but that's not today the occasion. In fact, I promised President Ruth Arnon I will not mention Higgs today here because she had to go through talks, one talk by Zehev, one by me about the Higgs, so she has enough about Higgs, so I will not talk about Higgs. But I have to make a few remarks about the general program of Cern to be able to explain to you how this international collaboration works in detail. Well, the main program now is the LHC in the tunnel of 27 kilometers, which was built first for another project, which was called the lab. It's now the second machine, and in that machine, in one ring, protons are running around in one direction, in another ring, protons are running around the other direction, and they collide in one point, well, not in one point, but they collide in 4 points, and what happens during this collision then is investigated. In these collision points, there are big detectors around them which observe what's going to happen there. And here I mention only the two largest ones. One is called Atlas, the other one is called CMS. Israel is participating in Atlas, as I'll explain later. And look, these are huge things. Here is a person somewhere. You hardly see it. Here you see a person in real life. So these are huge detectors. Each detector built by several thousand people, 2,000 to 3,000 scientists and engineers. And these are not built at Cern, but built outside in the countries by universities and national organizations. And then these pieces are brought to Cern, put together, and it's a miracle it works. I come back to that later. Now, the data which are taken by these detectors have to be analyzed, which is very complicated analysis. But of course, we do not want that this analysis is done at Cern, because the outside group want to do it at home. The home universities should be able to do it. So what has been done already for the previous machine and for this machine again, a network has been, a worldwide network has been installed, which takes this data home to the home universities. In fact, such a network was installed for the first machine lab in that tunnel, and this was called the WWW, what's now the internet. If you type WWW, was originally conceived only to be a possibility to transfer the data from the lab machine to the participating universities. And we never realized that that could be of any interest to anybody else. We didn't take a patent, unfortunately. Now, the data which are coming now from LHC are much bigger. They are about more than 25 petabytes per year. For most people, it doesn't mean much. That corresponds to the total world production of books every year. So the total world production of books is transmitted from Cern to the participating institutions. These are about 200, 300 sites all over the world. And this network is so powerful that few minutes later, after the data are taken at Cern, they are already available at the universities at home, and people can analyze the data at home as if they were sitting at Cern next to the machine. And I'm convinced, of course, that this grid, like the WW network, will be useful not only for high energy physics, but for many other sciences, even for finance, and I don't know what on. So I think it will be very important also for other purposes. Well, the only thing I want to say about the physics, what we do, is the following. I think what really surprises me, what enthusiasms me, is that, of course, what Cern wants to do is to investigate the microcosmos. What is matter? What are the constituents of matter? But it turns out that now the investigation of the microcosmos is married intimately with the question of the very big, with the cosmology. Why? Well, in LHC, the collisions we produce with the protons produce energy densities, or temperatures if you want, which correspond to the temperatures as they existed billions of a second after the Big Bang. So we are investigating matter at a state as it existed immediately after Big Bang. So the whole evolution of cosmos, in a way, depends on what we say in particle physics. So I think LHC will not only help to understand microcosmos better, but even cosmology. Well, talking about cosmology, some people asked about Big Bang, starting of the world. What about religion? Well, we had a little bit discussion yesterday. I had the occasion to discuss that with the Pope, John Paul II, who visited Cern some time ago when he was still alive. And I showed him this picture. I said, look, we are colliding strawberries. They collide, produce a fireball, Big Bang of very high concentration of energy. Out comes not only strawberries, but other fruits, even bigger fruits, sometimes even a fish that is a Higgs. So I said, look, what we are doing is creation of matter. He said, no, creation is my business. What you do is production of matter. So under his, this is the original slide I showed him. So under his eyes, I crossed out creation and replaced it by production. But then we had a further discussion. I cannot go into it today, but we agreed that no conflict between science and religion. These are different methods, aspects of looking at the world. So much about religion. Now, one thing which surprised me very much is why the media gives so much attention to the results of Cern, the Higgs and other things. Well, it's perhaps not surprising that the scientific journal Physics Letters has given the Higgs one of the front pages. But it's surprising that The Economist has given a front page to Cern results. And well, I think in a way this attention which Cern now finds is good not only for Cern but for science in general. For instance, if you look at this issue of The Economist, you find an excellent article where they explain why basic science is important for society. Even one of the spokespersons of Atlas, an Italian lady, made it on the first page of the Time. So women even can become a star now in physics. So I think that's another important point. It might encourage women really to go into science. It is a sign that women also in science can make a career. And maybe the most important thing is that all this publicity attracts the interest of young people, attracts young people, and will bring a lot of young people to science. Well, just in brackets, to correct the picture, the wrong picture which is given now by the media that Cern is LHC and nothing else is completely wrong. Cern has a wide program other than LHC. Cern consists of a very complex system of various accelerators and storage rings and so on. I will not go into detail, but each of these machines has its own program. I will not go into it, but just mention one thing. For instance, one investigation which has nothing to do with LHC is a study of antimatter. After the closing down of the machine Technion in the US, Cern is now the only place in the world where you can produce antimatter in larger quantities, large in quotation mark quantities. So the study of antimatter is one of the most exciting topics at Cern, nothing to do with LHC, mainly being done by US and Japanese groups. And there are many other things, but I will not go into. There are even some experiments for health physics, power production, and so on. So Cern has a wide program. Let me say make a few remarks about educational activities at Cern. Cern has an academic training program for the scientists working at Cern. It's like lectures like at a university. It has a number of schools for high energy physics, computing, accelerators, which travel around the whole world. It has a program for summer students, but a program which I consider very important is a teachers program. Cern has a program for school teachers where the courses are not only given in English is a language of science, but where courses are also given in the national language because school teachers have to learn how to explain physics to pupils in their own language. I come back to that in a moment again. Here you see there are about 2,500 PhD students just in LHC experiments, and you see the age distribution, which is peaking at 25, 26 years or so on. And what is important is, of course, you might ask, what do these people do afterwards? And here you can see what's happened to them. Green here, that is a part of them going into industry. Some go to university and other things, but more than 50% go to industry. And industry is happy to take them, not because they did particle physics, but they learned how to work in an international environment. They learned a lot of methods, computing, networking, and methodology, the methods how to attack complicated programs. Well, let me say something about how international collaboration works at Cern. Well, usually in science, international collaboration works. Scientists are relatively reasonable and rational. But what is a specialty of Cern? I think one of the specialties, there are many, but mention some, but one of the specialties of Cern is that it has carried out at least two big projects, LAB and LHC, each costing several billions, without a leading country. I mean, it was a collaboration between countries where no country, no matter how big or small it was, had a leading part. It was really a democratic way how consensus was reached as far as decisions are concerned. For instance, it was very difficult to convince the US to participate because here the projects at Cern were the first big projects where the US contributed $700 million on projects which were not on US territory and were not guided by US scientists. I mean, it was not difficult to convince our fellow scientists, but to convince the Congress, that was very difficult. Now, this model, and I come back to that in more detail in a moment, had the result that this year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, probably you know, Cern had been invited to present the way how its international collaboration works, and was discussed whether this model could be used for other organizations like World Bank and I don't know what. And Cern has also been, last December, been elected as an observer for the UN. Cern is the only scientific organization at the UN. Of course, it doesn't mean much, but still it gives a voice to science. Cern has the right to speak at UN meetings, so it gives a voice to science. Now, let me say a little bit more about the details, how these big experiments work, because that, I think, is very interesting. As I said, we are talking about experiments like Atlas and CMS, which I showed you. But these are not experiments. These are international organizations on their own. International, each having 2,000, 3,000 scientists. There are some other experiments. Each have a budget of $400, $500 million on their own, where Cern has nothing to say. It's their budget. But surprising thing, there's no hierarchical structure. There's no boss, no legal structure. Can you imagine an industrial firm where you have a project of several $100 million and no boss who is responsible, nobody you can fire? I mean, all it works by consensus. There are a number of committees, coordination committee, resource committee, what have you. They elect a spokesperson for 3 years who has no legal power. And they agree by consensus what your objectives are. They agree who is building which parts somewhere in the world. And in the end, the whole thing comes together and has to work, and it does work. Of course, the Cern takes care about the coordination of that. That is not completely unimportant, I think. But nevertheless, this works in a very democratic way. And it's to my mind, I think it's a miracle how it works. I think it would require a sociological study why it works. I think one of the main things is that physicists are so much interested in achieve a common goal that other things like money, personal money, and so on doesn't play much role. But there's a new word has been created now, which is co-appetition, because scientists, of course, are also ambitious. They want to make a career. But so what works here is cooperation and competition at the same time. So we call it co-appetition. Well, let me just touch on another point. Sometimes it said, okay, the international collaboration in science is fine, but scientists are reasonable, they work fine. Is there any consequences, any radiation effect on politics in general? Let me give you just a few arbitrary chosen examples. During the hottest Cold War, during the hottest Cold War in 1968, Cern signed a contract with the Soviet Union. I think no other Western country signed a contract with the Soviet Union about collaboration. And this contract, in a way, created a certain confidence between East and West, and it became later a model for a similar contract, or another, not similar, but another contract between the US and the Soviet Union, which was in the end signed by President Ford. So I was told that the Cern contract was a very important first step to reach another contract with the US. Another example is in 1985, there was a disarmament summit in Geneva, which lasted a long time. At a certain moment, the leader of the American delegation called me and said, look, we got in a deadlock, nothing happens anymore. Could you invite us to dinner? Cern territory is neutral, is recognized. Both sides have full confidence in what's happening there. We know it will not be misused. Could you invite us to dinner? Invited them to dinner and was told later that really during the dinner they came to a solution and created a breakthrough, and finally came out an agreement signed by Reagan and Gorbachev. Another example, when I cannot touch on it, was a cooperation between Cern and Dumna, which was a similar center by the Warsaw Pact, where, for instance, for a long time, the only possibility where German scientists from West Germany and DDR could work together was through such an agreement. Another example, in an experiment we had at Cern, was for the first time the Chinese from the People's Republic and Taiwan could work together in the same group on the same experiment, which required the agreement from the highest levels in those states. And so on. I could give you a number of examples where we could help people who had been in trouble, dissidents, particularly the Soviet Union, where we could help them. Orlov, for instance, was one example. Well, to close this story, I once had invited the ambassadors of the disarmament conference in Geneva, and at the end they said, look, we have learned that it is the objective of Cern to produce as many collisions as possible between particles. It's our task to avoid collisions between countries. But it seems that Cern is doing better in both respects. Well, let me say a few words about, of course, do the countries who participate in this international collaboration benefit from it? And of course, I will use the case of Israel to explain that a little bit. Israel entered particle physics in the 1960s by theory, like many countries, and there were outstanding people like Harry Lipkin, Neaman, Chaim Harari, and so on, and recently Rabinovich and Yakelovich, and so on. But the first work on modern electronic experiments were done in Hamburg, in DESY. And that was possible because the first contacts between Israeli and German physicists after the Holocaust took place at Cern. The man who was essential for that to take place was Wolfgang Gentner, who also convinced the German government to establish a foundation, was called the Minerva Foundation, which financed then this participation of Israeli groups at experiments at DESY. I was at that time director of DESY and was very happy to welcome this group there. And they made a lot of important contributions to the program. Then in the 1980s, when Cern built the big tunnel and the first machine in that tunnel, the so-called lab, the Israeli group were interested to join this project. I could even say they followed me to Cern because at that time I went to Cern. And Israel took a very wise decision. They said, in order to make in these large collaborations a visible contribution, we have to join forces. So it was decided that the three groups who participated, it was Technion, Tel Aviv University, and Weizmann, decided to join together and only join one experiment, and really there they made a big contribution. It was the so-called Opal experiment. George Mickenberg was the leader of the experiment. Then, at that time there were already discussions going on whether Israel should become a member state of Cern. There were all kinds of strange political and other problems. I will not go into it. But I say, since that time, Israel became a secret member state of Cern. As a token of the good relations which existed in spite of not being a formal member state, we had once a visit in '88 of the Weizmann Institute, which was led by Simon Weil, and Chaim Harari came, and Cern was awarded the gold medal of the Weizmann Institute. Now, when LHC then was built in the tunnel, Israel continued its policy of concentration. They said again, we will participate only in one experiment to make a visible contribution. And they joined the Atlas experiment, what they said, and they made indeed one of the so-called muon spectrometer. I will not go into detail what that means. A big piece of equipment, you see here a piece of the equipment which was built, and here is a group under the Israeli guidance who built that this part. So Israel again made a sizable and important contribution. So if the Higgs was discovered at CERN, Israel is one of the co-authors. Well, there are many people, of course, Israel are playing a leading role. I cannot mention them all. Let me only mention one, which is here, Eliam Gross, show you how engaged the people are. He proposed to his wife in the cave of the Atlas experiment down there. Now, what are the benefits for Israel for working at CERN? Of course, the main benefit is a scientific one, to be engaged in this adventure of studying the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. But there are a number of other benefits. Training. Also not being a member state, a formal member state, Israel participates fully in the fellows in the associate program, in the summer student program. For instance, there were 28 summer students in the last 8 years. Interesting, among them were 7 Palestinians. Israel participated in the teachers program, which I mentioned, and some of the courses were given in Hebrew. And a lot of know-how was transferred to industry. that would be another topic. I would require a new talk about the technology transfer to countries participating in these experiments. So I have to skip that here. So Israel is now on the way to full membership. The secret membership ended in August 91 when a formal agreement was signed. And this agreement is specified in protocols, and these protocols were renewed every time. And since then, negotiations are going on. The procedure of accepting new member states is now somewhat more complicated than before. Many points have to be discussed, not so much science, but financial and other points. So fortunately, these negotiations were strongly supported by the Israeli Academy of Sciences, by all the previous and present presidents, from Yaacov Zehev to Neaman, by the Committee for Budget and Planning, Tadmor and Yaacov, Prime Minister and ministers and so on, and the Cern Israeli Committee, chaired by Eliezer Rabinovich, which by chance is just meeting today here in another room. Now, since October 2011, Israel is a formal candidate to become a full member. It's a formal decision by Council, and I hope this transition period will finish this year. I hope that, I think it's only a formality, before the end of this year, Israel will become a full member of Cern, and then will get appropriate recognition of its contribution. Can Cern be repeated? Should it be repeated? I think hardly. It's difficult. It's, as I said, an international organization, and international organization is a somewhat complicated, heavy vehicle sometimes, and should be used only if it's necessary, if the political conditions require it. However, many of the details and reasons for the success of Cern, I think, could be applied also to national centers of excellence. Let me, if I still have a few minutes, just use my remaining time to talk about one of the offspring of Cern, which is Sesame, which is not yet a center of excellence, but I think it will become one. Sesame is here in Jordan, a laboratory for synchrotron radiation, again an international organization, founded precisely after the model of Cern. It's a machine, it's a light source, strong light source from ultrared to X-rays, can be used for all kinds of investigation. I'll come back to that. And I think the nice thing is Sesame is after Cern, the second laboratory who has in its constitution that it has two tasks: promote science, but also bring people together. The member states are, well, it's in Jordan. I'll come back to that in a moment. Member states are Israel, Egypt, Palestine, you'll be surprised, Iran, Pakistan, but also Turkey and Cyprus. Sesame is the only organization where Turkey and Cyprus, or the Greek market of Cyprus, are in an organization. So, and there are a number of observers, most of the European states, but also China applied to become an observer, and Brazil and India have expressed interest. Now, the whole thing started in Israel, you'll be surprised. In 1995, the Middle East Scientific Cooperation was founded, and the acting people were Menis Gauda, who at that time was Egyptian minister, and was Eliezer Rabinovich here from the Hebrew University. They started this Middle East Scientific Cooperation, which later was continued by Sergio Fubini at Cern. During one of these meetings, workshops of this meeting, it was proposed by two people, by Gas Voss and Hermann Winnig, that equipment of a machine which was closed down in Germany, in Berlin, should be given and should be used to start up a laboratory here in the Middle East. Then Fubini said, look, that is too much for me. you have time now, you retired as Director General, why don't you come in and take over? So I thought the only way that this could succeed was follow this example of Cern, creating that under the head of UNESCO. So we wrote a letter to Frédéric Mayor, who at that time was the Director General of Unesco, and he was enthusiastic and said, yes, excellent idea. So he invited all the governments in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean for a meeting in June 1999, where it was indeed decided to set up, to create such an international laboratory according to the Cern model. An interim council was established with 12 member states at that time, and I was asked to chair it. Indeed, later Germany made the gift and gave these components which we asked for. The site selection, of course, was very difficult. We had a proposal from 6 countries, but there were 2 conditions to be filled by the host country. The first one was the most difficult one. It must be guaranteed that every scientist of the world must be able to work in that laboratory. And the second condition was the host country should provide the ground and pay for the building. And it turned out, after, I will not go into long discussions we had, in the end we had a meeting with His Majesty King Abdullah II, and he promised to fulfill these 2 conditions. When I asked him, can I have that in writing? He said yes. Half an hour later, I had a letter from him signed that he would fulfill these conditions. And I must say, 10 years now, these conditions were fully fulfilled by Jordan. Now, then another story was the approval by Unesco. Unesco is a very complicated machinery. Usually, to create such an international organization under the Unesco roof takes many years. And, but Unesco was so enthusiastic about the project also that we could finish the whole procedure in a year and a half. I will not go into detail. It had to go through the General Assembly of Unesco, where there are 150 countries, and then the executive board, where are still 50 countries. There was unanimous agreement, no vote against it, and it was said in the final decision, this project is a quintessential Unesco project combining capacity building with vital peace building through science. So Sesame was created, and the site is here, is Amman, here is Jerusalem, here Seoul, the former capital of Jordan, and here is Al-An, where the Sesame project is. It's about half an hour drive from Amman. I must tell you a story. I was here 12 years ago and gave a talk here at the Academy trying to convince Israel to join this project. And there were, of course, several of the synchrotron radiation experts here, and some said, well, look, we don't need that machine here. We have access to all synchrotron machines in the world. We can go wherever we want. Yaacov, who was that time president, he said, yes, but I'm sure once this machine works, you will be the first one to use it. And I think that indeed will happen. So Israel joined it, and it turns out now in the users community, which has been built already up, is the full support by the Israeli community. And Anna Yonat, who is one of their outstanding persons, even wrote a letter to Mrs. Merkel last year asking that Germany should support that program. So, and indeed, I think the advantage, of course, is that from Weizmann Institute, somewhere here, it's within 3 hours you can go to the machine when it will be working, and that's sometimes important for if you have samples in biology which have a lifetime of few hours. Well, the ground was broken in January 2003 with a king present and Matsura, he was the Director General of Unesco at that time. And that is a building, how it looks today. So it's very nice. And inside the building, there will be a machine where these are injectors. These are the parts which have been given by Germany. And the main ring will have to be built. It's being built now. And there will be a number, about 16 beams, strong beams from ultrared to X-rays, which can be used for physics, material science, biology, archaeology, benzene, and so on. Now, well, here you see in the building, these are the parts which are there from Germany, which are being built and are partly working already. The surprising thing is there's no real political problems. Imagine another organization, well, I should say in the council, they're not scientists sitting only. In the council, they are representatives of the countries, of the governments. So tell me another organization where a government representative from Israel and Iran is sitting at the same table, peacefully discussing things. Or where, as I said, Turkey and Cyprus sitting there, Palestinians sitting there. It was agreed from the beginning, politics should be kept out, and everybody was following that, and so far we had no major problems. Of course, there are many practical problems with visa, money transfer, and so on, but these, I think, can be solved. We had, in the past years, the main problem were finances. Why? Well, maybe it was my fault. I thought at the beginning that the member states of Sesame should provide the operations budget, which in the beginning was $2 billion and will go up, and the machine will come into operation 2015 to $6 billion. That was no problem. Land, building, and all the beams we got from donors, also no problem. But for the main ring, we had made a proposal that requested money, $15 million, not so much, from the EU, Brussels. Now the trouble is that the region here does not fall under the jurisdiction of the research part of EU, but the foreign ministry, so to speak, with the so-called neighborhood program. And that was very hard. It's a long story. I will not go into it. It turned out, after an evaluation which they made, it turned out that the answer was excellent project. Money is no problem, but we do not know which program to use. And we were discussing that for 6 or 7 years, and the whole project was delayed by 3 years because of these bureaucratic problems at EU in Brussels. The project was at the point of failing. Then it was saved by Israel. In fact, it was Eliezer Rabinovici who made the proposal, who said that at least 4 countries, 4 of the member states, should each make a voluntary contribution of $5 million over a period of 4 years to build this main ring. Israel agreed, Jordan agreed, Egypt at that time agreed, but of course it's now is a little bit dangerous, not clear what's happening, but you will be surprised. Iran agreed, and finally also Turkey agreed. So that was solved. A miracle happened. Also the problem is the EU could be solved. Last year it was decided that the EU would not give the money directly to Sesame, but to avoiding this question, bureaucratic question, which program to use. It would give the money to Cern, and Cern would build the magnets for the ring. And Cern agreed also not only to build the magnets, but also to provide the staff to build them with the competence. So fortunately, this crisis could be solved in that way. Sesame has started a training program already since from the beginning, where the member states profited from it. We got a lot of support from the EI in Vienna, who provided more than $1 million for training, for fellowships, and also from the US and other countries. So there's the monetary value of the training program is about $1 million per year already now. So countries are profiting already now. And this training program will make sure that there will be a good users community to use Sesame. So Sesame is on its way. Many hurdles have been taken. Few minor hurdles may still have to be taken, but I hope that it will start operation in 2015, 2016, and if that happens, I think a dream of 1,001 nights will become true. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for a magnificent lecture, which really shows how scientific endeavor on the international level transcendent the goals of science that has much broader impact and significance. Very brief questions, comments. The first comment by Ruth.
It is just a coincidence that just in the next room, a meeting is being held now with the people of Cern and Vatat here concerning the possible joining, hopefully, the joining of Israel as a full member of Cern. And I hope that these discussions are successful. So we are neighbors now with the other room.
So we wish all success to both rooms. Professorship. Any other? Yes, Shimon.
Okay. How do you envisage the future of big science in the accelerator physics?
Well, of course, it will depend what comes out from LHC. If LHC opens up, have some interesting results which open up new physics, then it will continue. And in fact, there are programs going on. There's a program upgrading LHC, higher energies, more luminosity. And probably you know, there are also ideas of building a linear collider. Again, whether a linear collider will be built or not will depend on the outcome of the results of LHC, and will depend very much on Japan, because to my mind, the only chance to build it would be Japan.
Thank you, Professor Shepard. Last comment by Yadim today.
Since it's last, I will take the opportunity to make two brief comments. One of them is that the publicity of the current activities in Cern also owes to some very interesting accident of PR, because the particle is called the God particle, so although we all know what's the origin of the name. And maybe you want to comment on that. But the second thing is that there is now an attempt to have in biology an equivalent of Cern in Europe, which is called the Human Brain Project. Although it doesn't work in the same way, because the algorithm is different, still we are talking here about a very large project, which is a flagship, European flagship, with very shallow hierarchy, except one spike, which means that the center is in Lausanne. So just a brief.
Well,
if you wish to comment on the God particle, I'd love to hear.
Well, the God particle is typically media. I mean, as you said, probably everybody knows that Feynman has written a book, and he wanted to call it the God-damned particle, because it was so difficult to find. But then the publisher has the damned crossed out, so it became the God particle, which led to a lot of misunderstandings. I mean, I had it on one of the slides, but I didn't mention it. I mean, EMBL and ESO were two organizations which were founded according to the model of Cern, which were very successful also. And indeed, EMBL, I think, is working also very well. You don't need big accelerators, therefore, of course, the objectives are somewhat different.
In the Human Brain Project, we do need a very big infrastructure, which is a supercomputer.
Computing, yes, yes.
It's not the same.
Different scale. Different scale.
That's why we ask for more.
So we leave the scaling and just conclude that international science makes huge leaps forward. And thank you so much, Professor Shepard, for the beautiful presentation and for the stimulation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome our guests from abroad and our Israeli participants. And of course, Irit has just joined us, Alex's daughter. And we are very happy to have her here. We have now to try, it will be a bit difficult, to have a reset and from Sesame come back to something more close to us, the Israeli experience of centers of excellence. I just have, when you were talking about the ring, Professor Schopper, I was thinking maybe this ring will be a wedding ring in the Middle East of all the countries around, but We hope so. Anyway, the academy was certainly very, very active at the early stages, and well, it's hope. Now we turn to this session. This session, I'd like to say a few words beforehand. Alex, April last year, we're sitting in his house and we're trying to think about the seminar, the workshop that we are going to have here. And among other things, we thought, of course, we should have an international comparison what other countries are doing. And then, of course, we have to turn to the Israeli side. And the Israeli side is certainly fascinating. And Manuel yesterday gave a portrait of the ICOR. But when we talked in April last year, we thought that the landscape of scientific excellence or Israeli centers of excellence is broader. And anyone who looks at the program will probably identify that we are not talking just about the ICORs, but it includes some other centers. And I'm trying to refrain from using the word excellence, because those who are familiar with the INSF, Israel Science Foundation, in Hebrew we call it Mokdei Mechkar. And there was a discussion about whether we should use the term excellence, and we preferred at that time to use the term Moked Mechkar, which is centers of research. But now we turn to the centers of excellence, and what we have here is a kind of landscape of what is going on in the Israeli arena. We have the ICOR that was yesterday portrayed by Manuel Trachtenberg, and we also have a center of research in humanities, and Nama is going to present it. It's not just science, pure science, but we have a center of research in humanities. We have the ICOR, which also will be portrayed by both, I guess, Benny and Professor Dudai, and Shimon will also relate to it. But we thought that since math was certainly historically one of our strong parts in science, we should look at centers of excellence that were not forced by government or formal agencies or money from outside, but they're part of evolution. And we thought that math should be also presented here as something that Israel excels, but without any interference and without special funds. And Professor Lubotsky is here. He will probably try to give us a hint of this field. Personally, I was engaged in science administration almost all my careers, and I must say that I was lucky to work with my colleagues around here. Being an economist in my background, I gradually turned from quantitative measures, and I certainly agree with what Edward presented yesterday, that we have to be very careful. I can say that what I learned from my colleagues is, in science, minimum government is best government. And I think that Burton Clark, people who maybe are aware of some research that was done on higher education, sociologists, wrote a beautiful article that is called The Benefits of Disorder. Anyone who comes close to science will certainly see the benefits of disorder. On the one hand, you know that this is how scientific community operates. But it's certainly difficult for us to go and try and get funds from the government just by arguing that we want money for thinking, just for thinking. So I think yesterday Manuel gave us a superb example how you can, on the one hand, follow the needs of the scientific community and play the game of what government wants to hear. Bringing scientists from abroad, creating centers of excellence. Well, I can say in a very simple manner, if the governments buy it, sell it. So we will start first by a presentation by Professor Benny Geiger. And well, another note I think is essential. Alex was all his life involved in science policy, and I think this is the first time that formally we are doing something that will, I hope, build, not center, but build some kind of structure. I circulated this pamphlet and it's around, and page 59, I'll just read a few words that, from his Science Policy Center. If decisions about science are to be based on reliable information, a Science Policy Center for the study of Israeli R&D system is needed. The center should be a forum for workshop, meeting, discussion, group relevant to science policy, where people from various backgrounds and interests could discuss specific problems. I wouldn't go into detail, but I hope we are doing something to follow his will. So, Benny, please, your turn. Few words about Benny. Benny is professor at the Wildman Institute. He focuses on the mechanism responsible for communication between cells, both normal and cancerous. He was the dean of the Faculty of Biology and also the dean of the Feinberg School of Graduate School. And he chaired the Life Sciences Medicine section at the Israel Science Foundation. And now he actually is the scientific director of the Israel Science Foundation since 2009. Benny, please.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to review for you our sort of perspective of the ICOR project. And I'd like to try and do it a little bit in an historical manner that will highlight the contribution in the thinking about the project, the contribution of Alex Keynan at a very early stage, and then bring in some considerations that I think would be very interesting to see if we can develop a discussion around, because we are doing, we as Israel Science Foundation, and I think the entire team that is associated with running and designing and making the progress with the formation of the ICORs, different ICORs, we're doing something that was never done here before. And it's clear that we don't have all the wisdom that is needed in order to do it properly and correctly. And we are making every possible effort in order to learn how to do things as we progress with this project. And this is definitely an important opportunity to get some additional views and thoughts concerning the operation that we are associated with. So as I'm sure was highlighted by Manuel yesterday, the whole story started on March 13, 2010, with the decision of the government to form 30 centers of excellence. The name ICOR didn't exist at that time. So centers of excellence, there was a budget allocated to it, which was supposed to be provided by the government, by the institutions, and by strategic partners that never showed up significantly. And the total budget was pretty significant. For the Israeli academia, it was clearly something which was unprecedented in kind of a focal or focused attempt to promote certain activities. And there were several missions. 3 major missions were defined. One is to conduct excellent research. So these are centers of excellence. The title is centers of excellence. And the critical and enabling mission is to have a center of excellence where the excellence has sort of strongly underlined. The second is to attract new bright researchers to come to Israel, the idea being that this is an opportunity to bring back to Israel the very, very top scientists that otherwise might have to compromise on the science, and this will be, I would say, justified reason not to be here. And here there was an opportunity to try and tell them that we are not asking them to compromise on anything, and they can do the research at the highest level that they could do anywhere else. And the third objective was to support establishment of infrastructure. So this was a decision. We learned about it, I learned about it from reading the newspaper the day after, and it so happened that on March 15, 2010, the ISF team had a meeting in the offices of the PBC with Manuel Trachtenberg and some of his people concerning ongoing activities and issues between us and the PBC. And sort of we casually asked, when read in the newspaper about this fantastic program, who is going to handle it in terms of evaluation and regular operation? And it was clear that the thinking about it was sort of in the making in the PBC. And a couple of hours later, we got a phone call suggesting that we'll come back to a meeting in the PBC, and we were asked to join the project and take the charge in the evaluation and follow-up of the program. So this really started what I can call here a beginning of beautiful friendship that is sort of different a little bit from the one at the end of the movie, the Casablanca movie, but is really a very, very unique experience for us to work on such an amazing project with the PBC team and the other people that made it really happen. So perhaps in order to figure out how the Israel Science Foundation finds itself associated with the activity, a couple of words about the ISF for those who are not familiar with this organization. So the Israel Science Foundation is the major body that funds basic research and to some extent translational research in Israel. It is primarily financed by the government, and it supports a whole variety of projects, including individual research grants, which is a major activity. These are the centers, what we used to call the centers of excellence, or as defined by, as mentioned by Meir, the focal or centers of research, which we're forming, which is a gathering of a few groups that work together, not in the size of an ICOR, much, much smaller than that. There are special programs for high-risk projects at very early stages that are called FIRST or Bikura in Hebrew. There are research workshops that are financed, equipment grants are given, and for some, in some fields, publication costs. The budget was miserably low for many, many years, which many people around this room were trying to improve and work very strongly to get the government to support it in a much more significant manner. We are now in the process of essentially doubling the budget for the core programs, and in the coming years it will be a little bit more than twice as what it used to be in 2002. It will reach 585 million shekels. Now, in addition to these programs, which were traditionally carried out by the ISF, we started to see in recent years some what we call the targeted programs, which are those that are financed by budgets or by allocations that are external to the core program itself. They are financed fully from another source, which can be a specific foundation that provides a donation for a program on, for example, brain drain, which was already finished, a clinical investigator program, a biomedical program, diabetes research, and so on and so forth. And we found ourselves here in the middle of the Israeli Centers for Research Excellence, the ICORs, that were funded. Additional ones are petroleum alternatives and some international programs with China, with India, with the United States, some bodies in the United States, and so on. So that was our entry into the ICOR project. And then came slightly later another meeting. As I mentioned to you, for us everything was new, the dimensions were new, the concept was new, and we had to deal with the question of how do we define for that purpose excellence? How can we measure it? How can we make sure that it will be not another big chunk of money which is being put into activities that are hungry and need support, and basically will allow us to do more and perhaps better, but of the same. And the question is, what should we do about it? And many people actually were thinking about this issue, and there were discussions within the academia and around here. And I was invited by Alex Keynan and met him in his office here on January 15, 2011. And he was very concerned. He was really concerned. He was trying to figure out whether there is a way of making sure that this operation, with this big effort of the country to support research, will indeed be used properly and not just will serve as a kind of a lip service and nothing more than that. The question is, how can we make sure that it will foster excellence? He was trying to think not only of the prospects of something like ICOR, but also of the risks that are involved. And that was a very interesting discussion. And we spent at that time, I think, 2 hours talking about the subject. And this discussion went in two directions. One direction is actually very much, I think, reflected by this meeting here, which was, can we learn from the experience of other groups, other countries, as to how to do something like that, right? But at the same time, I commented, and Alex, I think, accepted that one has to do this, but with great caution, because the model that is serving well certain countries is not necessarily the ideal model for others, and we should find something that is suitable for us. So that was really a discussion in which he also discussed the possibility of running a conference like this one, that such a topic will be raised and will be discussed with a professional forum. So that in a way, I think, inspired many of us to start and think of how to shape the ICOR in optimal fashion. Clearly, that was not outlined, or we could not use literally the government decision as a blueprint in the fine details of how to do this activity. And we had to develop it and change it and respond to a lot of input from people out there in the university telling us what's good and what's wrong. And some of the people who sit here may recall meetings or gathering of people who are interested in forming ICORs, in which there were many suggestions, criticism of the approach, and so on and so forth. Now, to move forward, we had to define the certain missions and to form some operative team that deals with that. And there were several bodies, and I'm sure you'll hear, I'm not going to go into any detail of the activities of the ones which are not part of the ISF, but there was a steering committee was formed, headed by Shimon Yankelevich as the chair, who deals mainly with the policy, with the ICOR approval and follow-up. I'm glad to see here Arle Betalachmi, who is a member of the steering committee. There is the team of the PBC that deals with ICOR. Obviously, Manuel, who you heard, Liat Maoz and Noatal, who are here, who are dealing strongly not only with the finance and organization, but essentially with all the aspects of the ICOR and its shape. And again, you see the word follow-up several times, because we believe, or I believe, that the follow-up of the process is so critical, because it will really determine the future nature or the future fate of this program, whether it will be able to make a case for continuing it in the coming years. Then we formed the team at the ISF, which I was in, or I am in. Tamar Yafemitvo, who is running the director of the ISF, is there, and Ella Fire started to work on this as a special coordinator of the activity on behalf of the ISF. And we have collected a very, very distinguished and helpful and cooperating scientific advisory board which is sort of too big to list here all the names, with a lot of excellent people who helped us a lot in getting reviewers, in giving us advice. And we felt that with all this kind of team, there is a room for a lot of optimism. So the first question was, how do we reconcile, how do we meet all the different, or the main missions of the I-Corps as per the government decision, which we had to follow in one way or the other. It was clear to us that the critical one is the quality of science that will be produced by the I-Corps, and that was all along the instructions that were given to the reviewers, that not to look for just good work, but to look for something which is quite exceptional, beyond the state of the art, with a lot of synergy, with strength, and with a strong adhesion to the missions of the I-Corps, both for the country of Israel, for the science in Israel at large, and so on. We looked at, for leadership, for the capability of the I-Corps not to work according to external instruction or list of instructions, but according to a self-management, strong self-management, scientific one, promoting collaborations and so on. We realized that the absorption or the recruitment of new scientists into bringing them to Israel can use such centers of excellence as excellent incubators for the new recruits, providing them, besides the institution in which they work, providing them with not necessarily mentorship, to some extent also mentorship, but also an environment which is supporting and which allows them to reach their goals in a very significant and forceful fashion. The idea was to create instrumentation hubs, although the total budget allocated for instrumentation is quite limited. Still, it can be very, very specific, especially in some of the I-Corps. And it was important to figure out what kind of outreach the I-Corps will have. All these issues, I hope there's not call from me. The outreach was another element, and all these issues were seen by the reviewers. And then we started with the pilot wave, the first round of submissions that dealt with 4 topics: disease genomics, cognitive research, sustainable and renewable energies, and advanced sorry for the missing P, computer sciences. There were 9 proposals, and 4 became I-Corps. They were relatively large centers with about 25 members, plus about 6 recruits to be expected. And all 4 are very active, and I'm sure you'll hear from Yadin, if I'll still leave him some time for that. I will, really. How this activity is there. And I can speak for myself. It's visiting some of the events of the different I-Corps. It's extremely moving, because it's moving to see the young people who are there, that feel very much, sort of have a good feeling of team spirit with the other people. It seems to be a very open framework. Each of the I-Corps does it somewhat differently because of the nature of the people there, sometimes because of the topic. But this is really, visiting there gives us a feeling that this is an important and worthy effort. So our mission was to do the evaluation, and the evaluation was done in several steps, which I'll briefly go through. There are submissions. First, there are submissions of pre-proposals. The submission is pretty heavy submission, so it's not expected, it doesn't make sense to ask everybody who has a very small chance to win to submit a full application. So the first step is the pre-proposal step, submitted to the ISF. We run it by evaluation by international committees. Obviously, a project of that magnitude cannot be evaluated locally. I mean, this is essentially impossible to avoid conflict of interest situations, especially if you go for the professional people who can evaluate the science which is there. Then the recommendations of this committee are approved by the steering committee. Those that are selected can submit full proposals, again, to the international committee, again, approval by the steering committee, and then the ICORs are activated. The conclusions, after looking at the first wave, the first round, was that we should probably aim at ICORs of a smaller size, a little bit more focused, and we should go after more diversified topics that will cover not only the natural sciences, but also other topics. And that was the policy around the second wave, which I'm sure you heard from Manuel about, so just run it quickly. We have we have made a list of 18 topics based on input, a lot of input from the academic community at large, which was run by the PBC, and I think was an amazing source of information. I mean, you write to many scientists who are busy, and there was this huge number of responses that were critical for forming the list, both in the natural science, social sciences, humanities. We got a frightening number of applications, frightening for those who have to deal with the evaluation. 67 pre-proposals were submitted. We ran through the process that I described to you before. 26 on 17 topics were selected. And altogether now we have 12 new ICORs, altogether 14 in all these topics that I'm sure you have discussed, with modern Jewish culture, Abrahamic religion, information society, empirical law, mass trauma, quantum universe, biophysics and medical technologies, plant adaptation, dynamic cellular processes, and chromatin and RNA. So this obviously, well, I have here just a demonstration that all these ICORs are being formed by people coming from a whole variety of universities. And it's important to emphasize that in the entire process, the emphasis is not on the institutions. The emphasis is not on where the people come from. The emphasis is on the people themselves. The idea is that the team which is forming an ICOR, the question of who belongs to which university should not play any role in the evaluation, for sure, and the ICOR should seamlessly operate as a unit, as a functional unit. So there is a lot of interaction between different universities, essentially in all fields, in the natural sciences, in the social sciences and humanities. There's a huge number of people involved. I mean, in the applications for the second wave, we had we had 712 people associated altogether, some belonging to more than one ICOR. Most of the applications came from people in universities. The minority came from the not research universities, but colleges, the Open University, research institutions, or hospitals. And there was a distribution of different universities that were represented in different ways. One interesting issue that I would like to mention, and I'll be happy to discuss it if we have time later, is the question of how exactly can we grade or rate proposals that come from very, very different fields. How can we compare a proposal in high energy physics with a proposal on Abrahamic religion or on modern Jewish culture or on legal research? And the feeling was that if we need to do it, we have to, in a way, define parameters of excellence, which will be sort of descriptive, intuitive, but very, very clear, that will be operating, or that will be given as instructive indications for the different committees. And to our surprise, it became quite clear in the process where one could draw the line. Not always it was simple, not in every case it was easy, but the possibility to do this kind of distinction, I think, was for us surprisingly manageable. And I think we have spent much time on the question of how to weigh the different criteria. And I'm sure that Shimon could comment quite a bit on the necessity to define in the steering committee, to define the criteria that really provide the different weights for the criteria, young scientists versus excellence, contribution to industry, for example, and so on and so forth. So this is where we stand now. It was so far an exciting and interesting process. It was a new experience for the Israel Science Foundation. We feel that this is a useful exercise only if it is indeed a pilot experiment for the State of Israel, trying to check whether this is a good avenue of fostering, developing, and strengthening research in Israel. And if it will be found as a good process, then it should get future funding, and it should become part of the ongoing basic activity of the Israel Science Foundation in future years. I think we'll have to really study it in great detail and do a good and convincing job in evaluating the impact or the special impact of this activity, and that will certainly keep us busy in the coming years. So I would like to stop here and really thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Benny. And I made some changes. I thought it would be more reasonable to ask Yadin to give his presentation because it's part of the ICOR, and then we can see how the ICOR looks from the science, from the scientific view, one of the first ICORs. Yadin is going to speak from here, and I would like to say a few words about him. Yadin Dudai is the Sela Professor in Neurobiology at the Weizmann Institute. He got his PhD from the Weizmann Institute. He conducts research on brain mechanism of learning and memory, and is the author of many professional publications and several key books in the field of memory. He is also the scientific director of the Israeli Center for Excellence, ICOR. This is the reason that we are going to hear from his side. But in addition, he is got also from the European Community Flagship Human Brain Project, another ICOR. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Biology at the Weizmann Institute. He was member of the Planning and Grants Committee a few years ago. And Yadin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Meir. Thank you, Benny, for introducing 80% of my talk. Where is Benny? Briefly. So I thought that instead of showing you PowerPoints, PowerPoint is a very common and effective way of presenting data, I wish to make a few comments. As we say in Hebrew, 5 הערות על המצב. Some of you are familiar with the term. And I'll try to be very brief, which means I'll probably use more of the time that I'm allotted to. So I divided my comments into five classes, or groups of comments, of which I now remember only 4. In our field, in learning theory, there is a statement or a rule, which is one of the basic rules in learning theory, which says that if you wish to learn effectively, you have to know a lot already. So my view of the ICOR program was that the idea is not to create excellence, but to promote it, which means to capitalize on something which is already very good, and to try and to feed into it the structure, the infrastructure, and the funds necessary in order to make it even better. And my first group of comments is more general. I wish to try and explain very briefly why is it that brain research in general is considered in the world, brain research in Israel is considered in the world to be rather good. And those are interesting reasons for that, and I think they reflect on our idea of excellence in general without even claiming or trying to claim that the excellence exists only in brain research. No, there are other fields as well. So first of all, we entered the field in a very interesting period. Brain research
modern brain research is in a formative phase. So that's the time where you can amalgamate various disciplines in order to create a new one or provide a new face to an older discipline. And this gives an opportunity for smaller communities to excel because the tradition is weaker than the tradition in larger communities. So brain research undergoes a revolution. The revolution is not new. It's in a way already in the process for about 20, 25 years. But this is the period I'm talking about. In the past 20, 25 years, brain research in Israel sort of capitalized in a positive, constructive way on the fact that the new brain research is just formed. So we have an opportunity to enter the field and create something new. B, we used to say in science that whatever we do, if we do it right, it's on the shoulders of giants. So we also capitalized on previous professional excellence in Israel. So there is excellent research in Israel in biology in general, in the life sciences, in some fields of psychology, in computer sciences, in engineering, in medicine. And these are the professions that feed into modern brain research. So brain research does not start from scratch. You need all this excellence in order to amalgamate it, to combine it together. And without it, I don't think we would be able to create what we have in Israel in brain research. B, we are in the Israeli culture. I don't know how many of you read Startup Nation, highly recommended, although a little bit exaggerating here and there. In Israeli, and I see here faces that contributed to that, in Israeli culture, there is a sort of a common denominator, which is often good and sometimes bad. And that's it's very intimate, and there is minimal red tape. Although we used to complain that red tape is terrible, if you compare it to what I know from other universities in which I work, it's really minimal. And also we are used to the fact that we work together. If I wish to do something, for example, in engineering or in chemical engineering, for me to call Zehev Tadmor is very easy. I don't, and to do it in physics, I can call Shimon. I promise not to call you in the coming week, but that's what we do. So we are used to these intimate teams. It helps a lot in developing fields. I know it from comparison with other institutions. 3, we have excellent experience in R&D in the defense domain. And this contributes a lot. It contributes, A, to the fact that our students, the young PIs, and the students that become the young PIs, they come with huge experience. I just spoke when we sort of were waiting for this session, I told somebody in this audience that a young PI in my department, the one which we recruited, although in this case it was before the ICO was created, so he was recruited without it, therefore he's not as lucky as those who were recruited with the ICO, came to me and said, look, I had a terrible problem in my work, and we had to do some reverse engineering, and I came to one of my students, and that student was in Talpiot, which is a program in Israel created, I think, by Arale here. And then he said, oh, that's not a problem. I solved the same problem for another purpose. So the idea that you have students that have so much experience built upon the intimate connections and the multidisciplinary is very good, and it reflects on brain research. And then we have to also take into account that something which is common to, I think, the entire scientific community in Israel until at least the time that I'm familiar with, which is now, but mostly in previous generations, and I hope it will continue. And that's we have, I would assume that in my generation, 98% of students, of PhD students, went on postdoc period abroad, mostly to the States, some to Europe. This created an excellent background for creating your own lab later on, but also networking. The networking of Israeli science is excellent. Even in brain research, we actually envisage it well ahead of time, and we intentionally send people to centers of excellence to make sure that we have the expertise here and we develop further. And some of the new recruits in the ICO that I am fortunate enough to be the scientific director of come from places in which actually they were sent there, or not sent, but directed or guided to go there in order to gain the experience. And when now we are, and when you look at the meetings that we are doing, the best scientists in the world come here because maybe they like the journey, not something to be envied. It's usually 12 hours or 15 hours from the West Coast, or 16 hours. But the fact that they have their ex-postdocs here, the PIs that still collaborate with them. So I wish to mention also the BSF, the Binational Science Foundation, that was a very good agency to promote it. So this was one class of comments on excellence in science, in Israeli science in general. A few words about the ICOR that I'm referring to, which is the ICOR in Advances in Cognitive Sciences, and has a very fancy name, which is the Center for the Investigation of the Reconstructive Mind. I could have given you a talk of about an hour, much even happier than this talk, about what's the meaning of reconstructive mind. But the idea is that, and we can talk about it and discuss it later on, but the reality is actually reconstructed in your brain again and again. And if you think that you remember reality, I can give you some examples, but not now because it's not a scientific talk. So you can reconstruct reality. And when the ICOR notion became reality, we were actually ready for a project, a big project that will try to probe the mechanisms by which the brain reconstructs reality. What's the major problem there? Without delving into scientific details, the idea is that in order to solve the problem how the brain reconstructs reality, you have to understand two major points. One of them, the riddle of how information is represented in the brain, because in reconstructing reality, you actually reconstruct internal representations again and again and again and again. And B, what's the code of that? What's the neuronal code? And by saying what's the neuronal code, just by mentioning it, I immediately connect myself to the issue of the disciplines that I mentioned before. Because, for example, to understand neuronal code, you need computational neuroscience, you need biology, you need electrophysiology. You cannot do it just by being trained in one profession. So altogether, this fed into the idea that what is it that we need in order to probe this issue, which is the major issue in neuroscience? What we need is, in addition to the PIs, infrastructure. And infrastructure means, can we exploit some advantages that we have in infrastructure in Israel, and can we build on it in order to augment this infrastructure and make it even better? And then came the ICOR with the best idea that I ever heard of from a government agency. And I heard a lot. And this is the following. A, we recruit new scientists, and we devote at least, on the average, 50% of our budget. It's between, I think, 40 and 60% of the ICOR budget should go to recruiting new PIs. So you have here actually a constraint. You get the money, but you have to bring the new PIs. You cannot spend it on yourself. And second, you have quite a lot of money in order to recruit not only PIs, but infrastructure. And the advantage that we exploited was that we identified in Israel something which is unique. I wouldn't say entirely unique, but rare. And this is the fact that combining various centers of excellence already existing in science in Israel, we can create a spectrum of imaging techniques and methodologies that span the entire spectrum of time that the nervous system operates in. Which means we need something that will be able to tell us what happens in the brain from a fraction of a second to many weeks. To do that, you cannot use a single technology. You must have very different technologies. But even more important than having the technologies, you must have people that know the language and can have a conversation with an individual that works on another technology. So you need to combine to build a language. How do you do that? So we were looking around and found in Israel, identified in Israel, 2 or 3 centers with which we, and here I say we, was the Weizmann Institute because we were leading that, wanted to work with. And this should include, according to our idea, expertise in something we do not have, but is necessary for the projects of understanding how the brain works. I'm now using a general term. And also a clinical center. And there are some very good clinical centers in Israel that will enable us to go into an uncharted domain. And the uncharted domain is go and study the human brain. And you cannot study the human brain in a behaving individual without having a very strong clinical background. Not in the PI itself, but in the collaborations with these PIs. So I'm unfortunately not collaborating with you, but you are one of the examples for excellence in clinical research, and because of some ideas that we had, we decided on the medical center in Tel Aviv. Now we applied for the ICOR, and then we had the trivial idea that appears probably not to be so trivial at the beginning, to write a narrative. What is the concept that we wish to have? Not necessarily saying, look, we have these excellent scientists, we have this excellent infrastructure, we want to combine them together to get something new. No, we wanted a story. So we built a story, and the story led to the fancy title that some people in the ICOR thought should be going to the ICOR in literature, but still it's a really accurate one. So we luckily won, and I remember the call early in the morning from Benny Geiger saying the Hebrew-speaking individuals in this place would immediately recognize that he said, "Kan ela me'apais." I cannot translate that, maybe some, which means you won the lottery. This is the idea. It's not a lottery. We were 3 competitors, all of them excellent. All of them excellent. I would collaborate with each of them. They are excellent. And Brutus is an honorable guy, but still we won. And we had, at the beginning, 23 PIs, excellent PIs. Now, except me, but I want to take upon a point that Benny mentioned. We would probably have fared better without 2 constraints that you already know now very well, the people who deal with ICOR. A, the constraint that if you recruit, quote unquote, a person from one university, that university cannot participate in another competition on the same topic, which was resolved. The ICOR program was very receptive to that. And the second, we were a little bit too big, which means I thought that if I were to apply now, I would cut the number into 2/3, and I'm not going to tell you who's the third that will not be there. So we committed ourselves to recruit 9 new PIs, which is a lot, because if you have 23 and 9, you have to keep some balance, okay? And that's a lot, and my last point would be, why is it a lot? Not only because of the number. And we committed ourselves to do it within the first 2-3 years. We already recruited 4 PIs that are working in the universities, and nobody would recognize if they don't say it, or we don't say so, that they are new PIs. They are already really integrated. One of them became the head of a department in one of the universities, so we recruited not only assistant professors, we also recruited a full professor after 17 years abroad. And in Harvard, we recruit this year 3 new PIs. ICO people you don't know yet, but we have prepared the checks. We are recruiting these new 3 PIs, and we plan to recruit 2 PIs later this year, so we will recruit 9 altogether. What we try to do in our ICO, very briefly, in addition to the things that you had already, is that we try, in addition to support infrastructure, which we didn't have before, that will subserve all the PIs. In addition to support the new PIs, we also try to, we started a program within the ICO, to promote new collaborations among groups that otherwise would not have been working on that in that way. This is something that the ICOR allows us, and we do it in a competitive way. So you have actually a competition within the ICOR and a small amount of money that allows us to have startups. And this works very well. This year we have 3.5 startups. And we have meetings, scientific meetings. The next one will be at the end of the year, and we hope to invite, we actually invite, I'm not sure they will be able to come on such a short notice, our outstanding international board. We have a national board composed of Nobel laureate, of some people, that out of which 3 were in touch with Israel before, and 2 are new. The ICOR brought them to be familiar with the Israeli community. Group number 3, I included it already in group number 2. So I wish to refer to 2 points which are not unique to our ICO, to the ICO that I represent, but I think maybe are not shared by all others. So question number 1, which occupied me very much during the past, I would say, 10 years, not only in the ICO, but also when I was heading a department of brain research, neurobiology at the Weizmann Institute. What attracts excellent young PIs to join a scientific community. Now, this is a general question or general problem, but there is also an Israeli side to it. So I would say the following. In Israeli scientists, and my N here, the sample now is about 25. So it's a reasonable sample for new PIs, including department, including faculty, including in the ICO. So first of all, it's not a salary. I don't know how many of you know, but Israel is still a socialistic society, although it's not very apparent in some of the statistics. So the salaries for professors in my institute are all the same, unless there is something that Ruth knows and I don't. So they're all the same. The way to sort of manipulate it is just by fulfilling a position, an administrative position, or go to the president and cry.
Also having grants.
Having grants, of course,
Having
but then you have a...
Having
yeah,
grants
yeah.
change your
But
salary.
is it
Yeah,
the
not
same for
ICO.
everybody?
Yeah, same for everybody. The opportunity is for everybody the same. So when you recruit a new PI, you cannot, as in the States, for example, all of us were recruited in the States here and there, you cannot negotiate on the salary. You cannot say, look, you get $250,000 a year. The other guy got, you don't tell them, but the other guy, you find out, got 189, so you are happy and you come. No, this is not something that lures new scientists to Israeli science. What lose excellent PIs, and I should say at the outset, it's not the outset, already the end, that on each position that I was referring to in the process of the last 10 years, and using very strict criteria, I think there were between 3 and 4 candidates. So it's not that we had 3 and 4 candidates for each position. These were 3 and 4 candidates, each of which would have fit the position. Excellent candidates. So what led them to come here? The milieu. What they are interested in is whether the scientific milieu would allow them to operate optimally or close to optimally. Scientific milieu means whether they can talk to each other, whether they have the minimal infrastructure, and whether they are listened to. So again, we come to the point of intimacy and red tape, which attracts people here. The red tape is extremely important, and I think that young scientists that come to a system are very much afraid of that, although they do not realize that it will come anyway. So that's one. And the second point, which is unique to Israel, and we are not going to delve into it, is family. I found that many Israeli scientists return on top of being able to do excellent work, which is the first priority, because of family reasons, and this is something which is not related to the ICO. Last point, we underestimate something very crucial. This is not criticism on the ICO, I love it. But we underestimate something in recruitment of young PIs in the experimental sciences that I'm familiar with, and that's the cost. ICOR is an excellent program, but because of constraints, not due to the management of ICOR, the amount of funding that they can provide the young scientists is reasonable, but not sufficient. And I just want to give you numbers. It's not only that it's very expensive, it is on the rise, it's the ascending limb. It's not that we reached the plateau. So for us, I'll take the last 2 recruits at the Weizmann Institute and the Department of Neuroscience because I'm familiar with them. To recruit, each of them I'll do an average. There is a mathematician here, so I have to be careful. Yeah, it's an average of the 2 values. So each of them, without a salary and without the shared infrastructure, which means the facilities at the Weizmann in general, which are excellent and very expensive. Each of them was about close to $2 million just to bring them in, which means not the salary, not the support after year 3, not the support for the entire lab, just to build what they need, either the lab or the infrastructure and so on and so on. This is far above what we can get from a program like ICO. So what do we do? First of all, the minute an administration gets the idea that you have an excellent PI recruit, potential recruit, and you are going to provide incentive in terms of funding, they usually find some matching to support it. And also there are institutions in Israel which are excellent institutions which are less fortunate than some other institutions in terms of budget. And for them, the ability to recruit somebody, although it's less than optimal in terms of budget, is an excellent opportunity. But I would like to bring to your attention, if we talk about excellence, there is a check beyond that. And the check in biological sciences, in the brain sciences, is very heavy and fat. And to bring a young scientist, which closes the circle, without providing that scientist with the best equipment, it's no good. A, if they are smart, they wouldn't come, unless the mother-in-law really forces them to do that. And B, they will be really frustrated, and after a few years, they may leave the place. Last point. Not related to ICO, but related in a way. We had a conversation. Thank you, Benny, for the idea on the way here. There is a big project in Europe now in brain research. There are two projects now already announced, and one of them which is not yet announced in brain research, which show that brain research goes into big science. We envy the physicists, and we are going into big science. We have lots of goddamn particles that we have to look for. So one of them is called the Obama brain. That's the human brain mapping in the United States. The idea there is to map the brain, and that's why it's called the human brain mapping. It's around $100 million, as far as I recall. It's very big. It's an excellent team, and it's built upon the idea that if you chart the brain, you understand what it does. We can discuss it, of course, maybe. Yeah. But we wouldn't contest the idea that it's important to map the brain. So this is mapping the brain. There is another project which is larger in potential, which is called the Human Brain Project, HBP, which started with an idea by an Israeli scientist when he was a faculty member at the Weizmann Institute Department of Neuroscience, Henry Markram in Lausanne. And he collected data and then came, and I had lots of conversation with him then, and then said, we have so much data in brain research. There's no way we can, a single person, a single brain would understand what the data means. So you must introduce models, or you must introduce a bottom-up approach in which you relegate some of the understanding to computer systems. It's not the understanding, it's the computations that will lead to understanding. So this led to a project which has a fancy name, which is still called the Blue Brain Project, nothing to do with blue brains, it's just the IBM code for the computer. And that led to the idea that let's have big science in neuroscience, build it as a European flagship project, which is in information and computing technology, not in brain sciences, but it does brain sciences. We want that, and the idea is to run a project which will include around 200 labs in Europe and Israel. In that case, it's like CERN. We are part of Europe. Not only are we part of Europe, we are some of the sort of the initiators of this project, which still is in the process of being shaped to some degree, but the idea is to finance it over 10 years with $1.3 billion euros, out of which about 60% would come from the EC, from the European Community, and we want that, and we are now in the ramp-up stage of 2.5 years, which is only, quote-unquote, 50 million euros. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the scale in which the European Community worked here, just to prepare the project, they gave us €1 million. So without still promising that we win. So they spent €6 million on 6 competitors at the later stage. There were 21st at the beginning, and we won together with another project on graphene. So we discussed the possibility. Benny sort of brought the idea, which is that we should connect the two centers of excellence, the ICOR and the Human Brain Project. When it materializes, I am not happy yet until I see the checks, and the European Community still negotiates something there. And interestingly, if you look at it, the Israeli PIs in the Human Brain Project were selected in a different way than the ICOR, but all of them are in the ICOR. So there is an overlap. There are, well, all of them at the Weizmann Institute are in the ICOR, and the Weizmann Institute is 6 out of 8 scientists there. So we have an opportunity to extend the idea of centers of excellence in Israel to the European Community in a way of the Human Brain Project, materializing the Human Brain Project. And I think I probably took more time than expected. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I think I saw Arlie wants to ask a question, but I'll keep the... No, okay, fine. So we'll go on. I'd like to ask Professor Shimon Yankelevich to give his talk now, and this will be kind of combined the ICOR. It's according to this... Okay. Few words about... Professor Yankelevich also got his PhD from the Weizmann Institute. We are still within the Weizmann Institute. He became professor of physics at Tel Aviv University. He jointly is heading the Center of Excellence for the Physics of Basic Interaction, and he also jointly headed during different years, heading the Center of Excellence for String Theory from the QCD to Cosmology. He was director of Tel Aviv University. This is the administration part, and he is member of VATAT, the Planning and Grants Committee. And at the moment, he is the head of the steering committee for all the issue of ICOR. Please, Shimon.
Before I start, I would just like to tell to Yadin, now I understand Woody Allen's when he said that brain is my second favorite organ. When he was 40. Yeah, when he was 40. There is a saying in Hebrew that goes as follows. If you don't have anything new to say, don't say it in other words. I think that by now we have heard many things, and I would like not to overlap with things that have been said before, even though I think that I will repeat some of the things. And therefore, I will mainly not talk about the ICORs. We had heard pretty much about the ICORs from Emmanuel, from Benny, and now things from Yadin. I would like just to say that as far as the ICORs are concerned, I would like to stress this point, that we are in a stage now in which we have established the ICORs, and we now are going to follow their activity, as Benny said, and we are going to do the assessment. And the assessment is highly non-trivial. Highly non-trivial by all means, even after what Yadin have told us. We are seeing many good things coming out of it, but the real question is, what is the benchmark for comparison, whether it's successful or not? What could we do otherwise with the money that could have been perhaps more successful? I'm talking in general. We pride ourselves about bringing new recruits. It's excellent, and we are bringing new recruits, and I would like to believe that we are doing this in a good way, and we are providing means to institutions to bring these new recruits. But I would like also to say that many of these recruits would have been back to Israel, Yadin, even if the ICORs would not have been there, would not have been there. So where is the real extra that we are doing? The ICORs certainly have changed the atmosphere in the country as far as science is concerned. It has changed the atmosphere within the Israeli scientists which are abroad, and it also have created, I think, a move of students to go into science. So as far as the atmosphere is concerned, the ICORs certainly have done a lot of good, and I think that they've done much more, and I agree with a lot of things that Yadin have said. They have created new cooperation with leading institutions, etc. We have seen, for example, with as Emmanuel mentioned yesterday, a cooperation with the Simons Institute. We have seen the Italian government giving a postdoc fellowship through these ICORs. By the way, I think the Italian government would have been given this fellowship also in other ways. So the real question of real assessment of the ICOR and the benchmark against which we assess it is highly non-trivial, and we are occupying now ourselves really to find the real right assessment, because as Benny have said, we want to go further with it. We want the centers which are really good to continue, in which centers which made the difference, which are not doing much of the same, really to continue. And for this we will need new money for this from the government. And for this we will really have to convince, first of all, ourselves, and then the government that we are doing something which is really good and something which is not in the mainstream, and we achieve things that otherwise could not have been achieved. And again, the assessment, the benchmark is highly non-trivial. Another remarks about the ICOR that I would like to make, that through this process of the ICOR, and the ICOR was to foster excellence, namely to recognize excellence in Israel and to give them the extra. That was certainly the mission. While doing this, we have also learned about failure, things that we thought, or many of us were thinking that they are great in Israel, they are strong in Israel, and we learned out of the review procedure that was totally done outside Israel, yet that we are not that good. And the question, what we are doing with it, is a real question. And things have to be done. So I think that one thing that was very important that came out of this procedure is also to learn about the weaknesses in the Israeli science, in the Israeli science research. Okay, so I think that that's as far as the ICOR that I would like to say right now, unless I recall something. Now, my second remark would be to answer Edward's question. I mean, he asked whether there is a recipe for excellence. No, there is no recipe how to achieve excellence. If there was a recipe, such as we would all be following it, doing it, and there would have been no need for such a conference. We would not sit here. All that we can do is really to try to recognize excellence, to support excellence, to reward excellence, and more importantly, to facilitate the doing of excellence. And we have heard a lot about it. Third remark is we are talking all the time about excellence. Excellence are sort of a peaks, but if you want a real excellence, the peak should have a base, and the base should be a very strong leading science. You have to have something to build on, and Yadin described. I mean, to build this brain project, you have to be strong in various disciplines. Now we are used nowadays also to talk about interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. It's very important that all these multi will be based on very, very, very strong disciplines. Otherwise, things are shallow. We use buzzwords, but would not do the right. We are not doing the right thing. So the question of supporting excellence, and actually this session, according to the booklet, is not about ICOR, it's about supporting excellence. At least this is the title. So if you want to, so the support of excellence is very much correlated to the support of science at large and leading science at large. And here I would like to comment that in Israel, and this was also reflected in what Benny described and what Yadin was saying, the emphasis, okay, and certainly it's my belief that research, and certainly excellent research, is based first and foremost on the individual endeavor. The individual endeavor. There is a scientist, a researcher, let's say in his lab, with his group, with his student, with the postdoc, and that's where the real work is done. Big science is a different issue, and it was beautifully described by Professor Schoper. But the backbone is these things, and this should continually supported and promoted. And if you are going to have a vast base of really leading research, eventually excellence will come. And when you recognize excellence, you should support it, you should nurture it, and excellence will bring some more excellence. And this is something that we should keep in mind. We should keep in mind all the time. Now, we have heard during this conference also about basic and applied science. I don't like these terms, basic and applied. There is good science, very good science, and there is not so good science. And it can be basic, it can be applicative. This is the real distinction that should be there. In university, and it should be kept and carried, we are doing research which is curiosity-driven research. It's not application-driven research, which is mostly done, let's say, in industry or in governmental agencies. We are doing curiosity-driven research, and it might be in more basic things, it might be in science, it might be in technology, but this is the main issue. This is the main charter, and it should be that way and continue to be that way. And that's how we do things in Israel. It doesn't mean that one should not foster relationship with industries. It's very important. It's very important for both sides, the academia and industry. Certainly in Israel, we don't have a real R&D in industry. We have D, and we have R, which is very much connected to the D. We don't have an R which look 5, 10 years ahead, and that's the place, in Israel at least, of the university. And the university is the one that will eventually provide the industry with the needed next technologies. And as I think Zehev was mentioning yesterday, we don't know what is the next buzzword. It was high-tech for a long time, high-tech, at least in Israel, because the rest of the world have captured us, is sort of leveling. And what would be the next things, we don't really know. What we know that it will come out of the academia this time, less from the army, from the defense, and that eventually it will be carried into industry, and over there worked out by talented people, which were taught in the higher education system. So in Israel, what the emphasis of in research and in fostering excellent research is the emphasis is on the individual excellence rather than really, and in this sense, it's very similar, Edward, to the ERC kind of thing. But in the European case, you have the ERC, and the ERC is what? Is about 20% of the whole program, 15% of the whole program, and then, which is a lot of money because the program is huge. But then you have also other programs which are subject-oriented. They are subject-oriented. No, everything is competitive, but within a subject, namely energy, communication, you define subject. In Israel, it's mainly not, it's almost all, very little is done by subject. The main thing is really by excellence. And we have done pretty well by carrying it this way. And I was happy that you said that, in your view, the ERC is the one that is going to do the things for, is going to do the thing for you, because I very much hope that we'll continue in Israel to do it in this way. Another word about excellence, and here I will take the hat of a member of VATAT, is to tell you just, or to remind some of you, some things of how the Israeli higher education system is budgeted. It's budgeted by the PBC, and it's budgeted according to the performance. You don't look how many professors you are, that you have to pay the salary, that you have to pay electricity, that you have to pay the taxes. You look at the performance in teaching and in research. And especially in research is a very competitive kind of budgeting. Namely, there are parameters, for example, how good you are in receiving peer-reviewed grant, how good you are in receiving grants from industry, publication, properly normalized, a citation by impact factor, journals by impact factor. Anyhow, you have proxies. No, we can always say that this one parameter is good, this another parameter is not good, but you have a collection of parameters, with all of them are proxies, and you look at the institution by these proxies, and you also look by discipline. You don't compare physics to theater. Physics compete with physics. Theaters compete with theaters. And the way that the budget is structured is that it's a competitive process. And in any discipline, the leading institution gets a bonus in the budgeting. So there is a competition between the various institutions, and it also, in one way or another, forces the institution to work inside in order to foster and support the research there. Another thing that was mentioned here all the time is infrastructure. And infrastructure is a weak point in Israel, I think. And of course, the ICOR tried to do something about it. I would like here to say aloud that the Weizmann Institute is excluded in the sense that it's a rich institution which has much more, compared to other institutions, much more infrastructure than other institutions. And I agree with Yadin that experimental research is very, very expensive. Actually, my experimental friends tell me that the lifetime, that a generation in terms of equipment is something like 5 years, 6 years. Namely, there's a continuous process. It's not something that you do once and finish. It's a continuous process that you have to do. Now, we are doing quite a lot, and we have heard a lot about new recruits, and new recruits are the most important thing, because by the end of the day, the quality of your science, of your research, will be determined by the young people that come in, and as you said, Yadin, you provide them the means to do a competitive, world-class equipment, so otherwise don't bring them, you will just do harm for them, and if they are smart, they will not come in. We are doing quite a lot in trying to recruit this young generation and provide them with the means that they need. And institutions are trying to do quite a lot. And as we have just heard, $1 million for a new lab is not uncommon. And institutions are doing these efforts, The ICOR helps. If they have the ICOR, helps a lot, it's not enough, but they are doing these efforts. But the real question is, what is there after 5 years, after 6 years? What you are doing about researchers, really good researchers, in the mid of their career, when they need, again, this equipment? How do you go about it? How you introduce new infrastructure into the system? Not for new recruits, but for established world-class researchers. And here is something that we have just now, and and here there is something that, so we have heard, for example, okay, 3 minutes. So we have heard, so I'll be very brief. We have heard about Telem.
You need glasses to guess what?
I need glasses for anything. So we have heard about Telem, which is this volunteered organization between the PBC, the Treasury, the Ministry of Economics that put together money in order to get big equipment needed. And Telem should continue, and we have ideas of how Telem should go in the future. But in the meantime, what the PBC have done is to establish a committee that should finish its work by the end of the year. And this committee has the charter of putting what is called a roadmap for infrastructures and setting priorities, and also confronting such question of what we are doing with people in mid-career and how we support them. Once this roadmap is there and priorities are being there, there is, we hope, and there are already ongoing negotiations with Treasury that there will be some extra money that will be given there. Now I had some more things to say, but Meir says that I have to finish, and so I would like to finish by making just one more point, that really being successful in research has a lot to do also with the culture and the spirit of a nation. And this is something very evasive, and I'm not going to dwell with, but it's there. It's there. And Yadin described what we have in Israel. Other countries don't have these features. They have some other features. But it's very, very important. And I think that I mentioned to Eduard during lunch yesterday, he mentioned names of people that were integrated into the French system. Some of them I know. They are from my field. They are excellent people. But their cohort in the United States are doing better. What is there in the United States that they are doing better? Why in the United States they are doing better? And some of them, not in mathematics. Mathematics is different. I was talking about, and they are excellent. They are doing excellent things, but their cohort in the United States are doing better. By the way, in parentheses, I still think that the United States is the most successful country in terms of excellence and innovation for many reasons. And I'll end with a joke that I heard about it, that in the United States, if somebody is successful, then everybody wants to imitate him and to do as well. And in some other countries, if somebody is successful, what the other wants is to crush him. In Israel, we want both, right? So there is really a lot still to do. And we have to learn from our own experience, from experiences of the others. And what is very, very important, that anything that we do should be followed by an assessment, by an external review, to really know that we are on the right track.
Thank you, Shimon. Now we try to kind of reset. We had the first part of this session was more concerned with the I-Core, and now we try to turn to something a bit different. The next one is Professor Naama Gorin-Inbar, and we're going to hear not the term Center of Excellence, Moked Mechkar, Centers of Research, which was funded by the Israel Science Foundation years ago, and this time is Humanities. A few words about Naama. Naama is professor at the Hebrew University. She's an archaeologist, and she is leading the Center for Research in the Humanities. She did a lot of field work, and she had also professional services At the moment, she is member of Israel Antiquities Authority Directorate that was threatened by some political things a few months ago, and a number of publications, books and articles in archaeology. Nama.
Well, thank you very much. I will not bore you with any repetition of anything that was said here before, and I will go to the particle level because I'm not associated at all with the policy making. I just enjoyed tremendously the opportunity to have some money that got for us in humanities, even though you'll see that my humanities is very multidisciplinary. We got enough money to run some project that I've started years ago, and it will continue long after the money disappeared already. Oops, sorry. So the main point of the Center of Excellence was to trace climate change. You know, that's not really part of the humanities, but climate change depends on many factors, and for us to see what was the impact of the climate change on both the landscape and the environment and the habitats, and on one part all the geographical and geological and biological aspects, and on the other hand, what was the impact of the climatic changes on the hominins, on humans, and I think we are all interested in the humans. In this photo, you see Homo erectus. Homo erectus is the first person, or human, we call them humans, because they had the abilities to leave Africa and colonize the old world. So the first indications are very ancient, but around 1.8 million years ago, this creature that had quite an enormous brain in comparison with what had happened before them, they were capable of coming out of Africa. And we in Israel are extremely fortunate to have two sites that are actually a huge archive of these people who came out of Africa, and we know this because of the cultural remains that they have left us. So the study of how these people adapted to the Levant or to the Levantine corridor on one hand, and how they were able to continue excuse me, to continue the road and go ahead and colonize first Asia and only later, much later, Europe. This is one of the results that we could aim to get out of our study. So we had 4 groups in our Center of Excellence. The first group was the group of the paleobotanists, and they are from the University of Bar-Ilan. And they had, of course, a great archive to study about the remains. I'll go a little bit later on the details. The second group was the paleontologist or the zoologist, because what we are interested in this particular site that I'm working on, which is about 750,000 years old, what was the landscape like? What was the biology like? And if you took the road to go to Lake Hula in the morning, will you meet an elephant or will you not meet an elephant? And you did. And not only one elephant, but several types of elephants. The third group is a group of the geologists. A lot of biochemistry, a lot of isotope studies, and understanding about what were the environment that we're looking at, how the southern part or how the Hula area looked like, and the lake and its margins. And the fourth is the humanities. We were speaking about the multidisciplinary approach some time ago, and this is actually what we can do. We can reconstruct or try to reconstruct the environment and have a look at what is coming up from this. I think I was horrified yesterday. I heard that my colleagues reported 4,000 articles or maybe 400 articles. And I said, oh, gosh, you know, we came up only with 27 articles, 2 books, 20 more articles in the oven. But basically, even this crop was not easy to come with. And I think some of the results are interesting. And what I would like to do is to give you just a few minutes. I know everybody is very hungry, and I was left at the end, a few minutes of the highlights of what such a center of excellence can come up with. Yeah. So on the right-hand side, you can see the site as it was excavated long before. For 7 seasons, long before we had the Center of Excellence, but we are actually bouncing, the sediments or the geology is bouncing between the Arabian plate and the Sinai plate, and as a result, everything is tilted, upside down or tilted, and to excavate this was quite a difficulty. The site is actually located along the Jordan River, on both banks and on the riverbed, and it stretches for about 3.5 kilometers. This is African site. You don't have usually sites in Israel for that the length axis is 3.5 kilometers. The excavations basically provided the database on which the Center of Excellence was thriving. In addition to the, I thought I had another slide, but in addition to the excavations, we also drilled. We have 2 drills that we have done, one to the depth of over 120 meters and one much shorter. And this also provides us with a fantastic archive. And one of the main points of this project is that the site is waterlogged. So the first time in, say, 250,000 years ago, we are able to look at the vegetation, we are able to look at the landscape, and we are able to see how the humans who came from a very different background from the African savanna were able to find themselves or to go through adapting different adaptations to that material. At the site, we have this is a composite section, we have about 34 meters that yielded from top to bottom a lot of assemblages, biological, paleontological assemblages, paleobotanical assemblages, and of course the presence of humans from the bottom to the top. We estimate the duration of this sequence for about 100,000 years. And this is one of the most important points when understanding what is going on. How do they continue to Georgia, or how will they find themselves in England sometime later, is the fact that it's not the people are packing their rucksacks and with stones and their material culture, and they're going out from Africa, and they will find themselves in India or in Java at the end. But it's a question of how they establish themselves and what are the processes of adaptation in different places. So these are the goals and the landscape and the reconstructions I described. We wanted to know much about the culture. We wanted to know much about the cognitive abilities of these people. We checked the issue whether these people had already fire and what was their diet. And also something which is very modern and was not mentioned here specifically is the social brain. This is what is the sociality of these people and what it triggers when it's in action. So a few highlights. This is the, on the left-hand side is all the strata of all the site of Gesher Bnot Yaakov, all the layers. The bottom are the oldest, the top are the youngest, and on the horizon you will see all the different animals that were existed. And you can see that 2 types of animals were in favor of the hominins in terms of diet or landscape, This is the elephants, and this is some type of the fallow deer, a deer that is known from both Asia and from Europe, but it's not known from Africa. And we are in a cul-de-sac where we have a lot of different types of organisms coming. Some of them are endemic to the Hula, and some of them are coming from Africa, and some of them are coming from Eurasia. So already we know what was available on the landscape, and already we know what was in favor, what kind of stake these hominins preferred. We also had an insight into the way, on the left-hand side, into the way in which the humans cut the carcasses. Nowadays, you ask the students, I ask the students, okay, you go to the supermarket and you buy a fish, a complete fish. How do you go about it? And they have no idea. You know, it comes under the plastic and it's all done there. But I think some of the people in this audience know that there are several ways to cut a chicken and several ways to cut a cow, etc. On the left-hand side is the location of the cut marks, where the tools, usually flint or basalt tools, hit the bones in order to get rid of a muscle, of a tendon, and so on. On the right-hand side, you have a map, a similar map, but this one is very young. The left one is 750,000 years old. On the right-hand side, it is about 30,000 years old, and we know for sure that it was made by modern humans. So we can already see that the abilities of these hominins were quite developed. We have something like 40,000 remains of fish fragments. And in these photographs, you see fish teeth. And these fish teeth are belonging to a carp that, which is eating mollusks. We were able to identify the different species, and we are also able to show for the first time, for this time period, that the people actually consumed a lot of fish. Fish were thought to be a component of the diet from 30,000 years onwards, but evidently it started much earlier, and it has a lot of important understanding of how the hominins, in terms of the diet, divided the sources and what was taken up once and again. The site, as I mentioned, is waterlogged. So there's a fantastic conservation of wood, bark, seeds, and fruits. And this is actually a fantastic archive, because we don't have, for these time periods, with all the wealth of the African studies, we don't have anything like this. We have, about 100,000 parts that should be identified, conserved, and of course, analyzed. And the identification of the wood and the climbers and the bushes, with this we were able to see how was the landscape in those times. But the fruits and the seeds, we have a fantastic archive of what was growing in the old Lake Hula. And we were very surprised that the number of extinctions from the early Pleistocene to the Holocene to 1954, when the lake was drained, is actually very similar, apart from some species. And in the photograph, you see one of the species. It's a prickly water lily that was growing in the Hula. It's now very common in India and goes all the way to Japan. It's very thorny. It's very difficult to get it. And there is a fantastic procedure that I was able to collaborate with my Indian colleagues and to see how they go traditionally about it. And the end result of this is that the nuts of this prickly water lily are sinking into the bottom of the shallow lake, and then in order to retrieve them, one has to dive. So there was, I think, and then they collect it, they dry it, and then they roast it, and then they pop it. And what you see here is these seeds that are popped It's the state of Bihar in India provides about 50,000 tons a year of these popped seeds. So popped seeds like this existed in the Hula Valley, and nutritionally they are a fantastic component. They're very low in fat, but the value is very good. We were also concluded that the process that was taken out by the hominins at the Geshem Bnot Yaakov was similar to that of the Indian ethnography, because we were able to show that there is fire and there is popping at the site. We have done a lot of research concerning the stone artifacts. This is the major thing that we are dealing with. It concerns provisioning, where they go to collect the material. They're using 3 types of raw materials, the technology, and everything that connects with this. You cannot kill an elephant and consume it unless you have the appropriate tools. So everything really is multidisciplinary, and everything is tying up together. Now we'll see how I can work it. And oops, okay, I'll jump this. I wanted to show an archive. An archive. What is? I cannot see. 5 minutes. I will finish before. I wanted to show you that we have made a 3-dimensional archive of all the artifacts, and it was a very important feature in the project, because many of these things continue to weather in situ in the university, in the drawings, despite of all the conservation processes. In here is very little, and I don't think you can see very well. This is a plan of what they did when they wanted to achieve a tool, a biface. This is what I'm talking about is the Acheulean culture, and the Acheulean culture is known for its bifaces. So this map is actually what happens when they look to search for the basalt items, and then they start to make a series of steps that we can follow now very well. When we look at what they did with the limestone, when they wanted to use the limestone, the procedures are totally different. So by now we are capable of saying that the early hominins at this time had a lot of cognitive abilities. They were capable of planning and going through many different stages of production, because we have also the sequence of one site. We have more than 15 sites, one on top of the other. We can assume that these people had to communicate and to speak, because they collected the same types of raw materials, and traditionally they made the same tools. And therefore we think that they were a very developed mean of communication, and we already wrote several times that we believe that they actually had a language. We cannot hear the language, but by the sophistication of and multiplicity of the stages, we are capable of saying this. We have identified a lot of artifacts. They were burned, and we came with a conclusion, and we published also one of the books within the project about the presence of fire. We have the best evidence and the earliest in Eurasia that the hominins used fire. And this, of course, has lots of meaning about the diet, about the development of the brain, about different aspects that lots of colleagues are talking about. And you can see here a series, just a sample of some of the levels, a series of these hearths, which we don't see them, but we know about them through the burned materials. The two additional aspect is the spatial organization. And in order to understand what is the degree of the sophistication of these people, we have made a lot of spatial analysis, and we can now associate the hearths, as you can see here, and concentrations of artifacts, and concentration and study particular types of artifacts they appear. And by ethnographic analogies, we can see that the hearth was, or the fireplace was always a location of a center, and you can see it traditionally everywhere in modern societies. of hunters and gatherers, and it is this one is just an example of stone artifacts that were done next to the fire. You have all these different rounds here are pitted stones to crack open nuts, usually nuts, sometimes bones for the marrow, but that's another story. And this is done with the nuts on the fire. That's how you pop this prickly water lily and crack open other nuts that you roast first. And I was speaking about the fish. During the excavation, one cannot see the distribution because it's all muddy and we had to pump and do different things. But what you can see here is on the bottom of the photo, you can see in red the concentration of the burned artifacts, which means the hearth or the fireplace. And on top of it, you can see that there is a lot of concentration of fish bones. They are not dispersed on the surface, but this means that the way in which they processed the food or the way in which they behaved is extremely similar to modern humans and the way in which they behaved. Other questions, and I have 2 more slides, so don't worry. Other questions are, what was the size of the group? And usually in most of the textbooks and most of the articles, when you read about early humans, the assumption is that they are moving in small bands, about 5 to 6 families. The photo that you see here is a picture of a very small excavation area. You can see the size of Dr. Gonen Sharon, my student. But every single animal depiction that you see here is actually a specimen that was found here. There's no way that a family of 6 families could produce this kind of wealth. This calls for some kind of thinking newly on this issue of what was the collaboration, how many people were involved, what was the social, how the social brain was acting, and what was the imprint on the site. The photo here on the left-hand side is on the field mine, which is adjacent to the site. When humans cannot go into this area, the hula is actually coming up to the natural and very persistent situation. There were climatic changes. I don't have time to speak about it, but the amplitude was not drastic, and the number of species that disappear are very minimal. So if we let the nature, and in terms of future, at least in parts, go back, we can actually see a fantastic continuation of different aspects in this part of the world. I would like to say that without the help of the Israel Science Foundation, there would have not been research in prehistory in Israel. And this should be taken very seriously because, of course, we cannot be competitors with ICOR and very rarely, as you will know, with the Centers of Excellence. But what actually kept us going for the last, in my experience, over 40 years is the Israel Science Foundation. Of course, the Hebrew University, my host, and other institutions were very helpful. And I would like, of course, to thank you for inviting me for a short explanation on humanities of the early humans. Thank you very much.
Naama, thank you. I know that we've been torturing you all this morning, but Professor Lubotsky is the last one, and he promised to do it short. Professor Lubotsky, please.
Okay, so I was asked to present and talk about the Einstein Institute of Mathematics of the Hebrew University, which has been considered always in Israel as a center of excellence, even without the official title. If I have to prove it, I will just maybe mention some of the many honors and international prizes that members of other departments got, like 1 Nobel Prize, 2 Wolf Prize, 1 Fields Medalist. And if I counted correctly, there are 9 or 10 of other members of our department don't rely on my counting, because as you know, there are 3 types of mathematicians, those who know to count and those who don't. And anyway, there are 9 or 10 members of our department who are members of 1 or 2 of the American Academies of Science. And that's, I think, something which is quite remarkable even for a university in the United States, but I don't think there is any university outside the United States with so many members like that. Anyway, I won't go away, because if you invited me to talk about that, it means that you agree that we have this type of excellency. What I really should talk about is why and how the math department managed to be such a center of excellence for so many years, for like 80 years since the establishment of the department. And in this case, this is an interesting case. In fact, I'm holding here a kind of a research, a booklet, which was written 25 years ago by Shaul Katz and Professor Eisenstein.
Shaul is here.
Ah, I didn't know. Okay, good. This was an interesting case study because this was kind of a counterexample to the sociological theory which asserts that it's impossible to have such a center of excellence in a small country for the reason you can suspect there is not enough people to create, there is not enough money, there is always temptation to go to the bigger center, etc. Anyway, what I want really, part of my work is really based on this, but I will try to add a little bit from the current story. What seems to be the reason for this excellence is, first of all, as was mentioned a little bit here, there is a Jewish tradition of learning for the sake of learning, not for reason. What we say sometimes in Hebrew, geffen, something which is good for nothing, just for the sake of learning. In some sense, mathematics is the modern Talmud. You know, people study Betzah Shenolda B'Yom Tov, even if they never saw a chicken, they study about rules related to that. And in some sense, there is a kind of respect to that, I think, in the society, which certainly help. In fact, this is worldwide. There is a lot of Jews in the world, and I wouldn't say that they are dominant, but certainly by far more they're the numbers, and even more than in the other sciences. And this is related to the fact that when the Hebrew University was established like 85 years ago as a union of several small department institutes, the math department was the only one who managed right away from the beginning to attract almost the beginning, Landau and Frenkel, who were well-known mathematicians in Europe, and they moved to Jerusalem, one for a short time and one for a lifetime, and brought a lot of prestige internationally, but also not less important is within the university. If one goes and read protocols from the early days, you see that people say you cannot be excellent in everything. Well, here there is an opportunity to be excellent in one thing, we should really push. And I have to say that all over the years, the math department was a little bit kind of the spoiled boy of the university, and never really been a problem in getting position if we wanted, but the department also knew not to take advantage of that. In fact, if one look at the history, like between the 50s to the 80s, where the academia in Israel in general and the Hebrew University expand dramatically, the math department grew out much less than the others. And somehow the criterion was always to pick up the right people, not and only extremely good people, not because we can get now a position. Now, there is also price to that, which I will say in a minute, because I want to show you also some of the problems and difficulties, and not just to praise ourselves, because I'm a bit worried about some signs for the future. Anyway, so the university recognized this opportunity and always gave us, and also we have to be honest, mathematics is a cheap subject. if Yadin talked about before how much it costs to get a biologist, we can get 7 mathematicians for the same price.
Don't trust your calculations.
That's also true. Probably not 7, probably 14. But there was another aspect which I think was phrased very much in this booklet, and I think we can proudly say that there was somehow, and here I don't know if it has to do anything with mathematics or just with some kind of a luck, there was always an outstanding leadership over the generation of the math department. And the math department, the Math Institute, was the first one at the Hebrew University to get out from this anachronistic system of one professor who is the boss and everyone works for him, which is not, let's put it mildly, is not the best method to create good science, even if the boss is extremely talented. And also the process of appointment in the department was always very democratic. In our department, always until today, all the permanent members are taking part in the process, the junior one and the senior one with the same voice, somewhat to say, and somehow I think sometimes, you know, the younger people, they have a better touch of what's going on and who you should take than the full professor, or sometimes a little bit out of that. Now this is an extremely important and in some sense surprising aspect, because most of the people in our department are what is usually considered to be very bad system, namely of inbreeding. Because it used to be that 2/3 of our faculty were graduates of the university. Now it's maybe less than half, maybe around 40%. But still, this is huge by American standards. In many universities in America, there are unwritten rules not to give position to graduates, because, you know, it's clear. Then you give people you like, or people who will push your legacy or something. And I have to say, being in so many discussions like that I always felt proud and so good that people are not pushing their students. They are really doing it very honestly. I think, and also this was pointed out, that the process of creating, promoting students and teaching students, I'm talking now about graduate students in our department, is somewhat different than what is common in many of the other sciences. It's almost always that the project of the student is not a sub-project of his advisor. Moreover, I can talk for myself, and I think for most of my colleagues do, I haven't checked, I don't write papers with my students. Eventually, their work appear only with their name, and sometimes with other students they work with, and not with the advisor. In some sense, it's a very independent work. It makes their life more difficult somehow, because it's easier to work with an experienced guy, especially in the time of frustration that you are stuck. And you know, I think I and my colleagues are pretty nice people. If they come to us for advice, and they do come, we give them, but in some sense, this is their product. And I tell you, sometimes I can talk for myself that I want to think about his problem. I'm interested, but I try not to, in some sense, not to jump on his wagon. And I think somehow, you know, in some sense, you know, we throw them to the swimming pool. Some of them who cannot swim, indeed, don't manage. But those who manage, I think, are doing better. And in fact, our graduates are usually doing extremely well, and they are getting very good postdoc positions at universities abroad in the top places. But if I really have to summarize all this, I have to and to say what's the one best success, it's not ours. I think it's a huge Zionist success to bring people back together, back to Israel, because everyone who gets an appointment in our department could get a position at one of the top universities abroad, and even mathematicians who don't know to count know to compare salaries. and they know how much they will get there and how much they get here. And still, I cannot say that all of them, but usually people who are coming or we want back are really coming back. But I want also now to take 3-4 minutes and to talk about failures and worries for the future, or better to say challenges for the future. First of all, I think there is one big failure of us, and this is that we don't have a strong group in applied mathematics. Somehow it was always defined, at the beginning even formally defined as a department of pure mathematics, and talking about Jewish tradition, Jews like pure mathematics, maybe they don't like, but I think it's a failure. I think it's a failure because of the need of the country, but I think also it would be good for the pure people somehow to be inspired by problems coming. We succeeded very much with the computer science. Even though nowadays computer science department is independent of the math department, it really grew up as a sub-department, and it really grew up to be an extremely good computer science department, but the other aspects of applied mathematics are not so good, and there is something to talk about that. One thing that which I have to say took us now a little bit of frustration is to realize that we are not anymore the only game in town. Namely, there are very good math departments at the other universities, and suddenly we have to compete about new people. 20 years ago, when I came to the university, I grew up at, I don't matter, Bar-Ilan, I got an offer from Jerusalem, I packed and come. It doesn't matter what my university offered. For me, it was such, it's not anymore, it does not work like that anymore. And there is one aspect which worries me for all. And this is, in some sense, completely not related, but I think very much related to the discussion around this table. And this is the situation of the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem, which used to be an asset for the university, became a problem for the university. And that's, I think, even the high kind of boards of the university hasn't realized that yet. Because this you feel when you sit in committees, when you want to hire young people, and it doesn't matter what's the truth, the perception that Jerusalem is an ultra-Orthodox and Arabic town, and is not appealing to many of the young generation.
Also students.
Also students. But with faculty, the kind of people that we want, and the people we want can get position in Israel wherever they want. And I have to admit that in the last few years, sometimes we got no. It was very difficult for us. And we have to learn that we have now to compete in the market. And I think that in some sense, that's the one thing which worries me more. I mean, for my department and for the Hebrew University as a whole. Thank you very much.